So just as an aside, earlier this week, I asked Kimberly what the plans were for special music, and she said, "Well, your son's singing." And I'm like, "I know that." And then I said, we started this worship series with a kind of sing-along medley, and I think people really enjoyed that. And it's summer, and we can do things we wouldn't normally do. We should end it that way too." To which she said, "Okay." And I think it was a little remiss to tell me how much work it actually is to put something like that together. So thank you, Kimberly. I appreciate you indulging us. All right. So, like I said, this morning we are bringing to conclusion our road trip worship series. And to get us started off, I want to talk about something close to my heart, which of course is science fiction. In 1999, probably what is arguably one of the best Star Trek movies was released. And I know what you're thinking to yourself right now, Jeremy, Wrath of Khan came out in 1982. To which you'd be like, yes, exactly. One person got that joke. Thank you, Chris. Which would be true. But no, what came out in 1999 was a movie actually called Galaxy Quest, which you're thinking isn't actually a Star Trek movie, but it both is and it is not. No, it's not made by the Star Trek people, but it's probably one of the greatest acts, one of the greatest things of fan fiction that has ever been made, and was clearly made by people who have a deep and abiding love of Star Trek. So if you haven't seen Galaxy Quest, I'm going to ruin it for you completely this morning, but you've had 23 years. That's on you. Not completely, though. Galaxy Quest was actually a really amazing movie, to the point that actually the playwright David Mamet would later call it one of a handful of perfect movies. It's fun, it's got adventure, it's got all kinds of good stuff, and it's got a great storyline. Now, in the story, what ends up happening is there's a group of people who played the characters from a TV show in the movie, which is a little confusing when I explain it, but it makes sense when you watch it. And so the story is about them as actors later in life after their show has been canceled, and they're going to conventions and doing appearances and doing all those things that like the Star Wars and Star Trek actors do now. But it's all a little bit more sad and a little bit more kind of pathetic in a lot of ways. And there's a little bit of poking fun at the fans, to which I did not take personally at all. But what ends up happening is eventually, as the story goes on, this group of actors find themselves in conversation and eventually sort of almost abducted by actual aliens who need them to help save them from some evil guy who's just kind of one of those generic evil characters who's just bad because he's bad. And so it's a very kind of funny scenes as they figure out what's going on. And there's this funny kind of back and forth between these people who know that they are actors and know that they are not actually, members of like Star Command or anything like that. And these aliens who don't know that. And the aliens, called the Thermians, don't know that because in their life and in their culture, they don't have what we know of as fiction, right? They don't have fiction. So when we beamed our television into space, which we are doing, and we've talked about that before, that some alien species' first introduction to us as human beings is going to be our television. And as they watch it over the years, I'm sure they're going to wonder what in the world happened to us, right? I mean, yeah. Anyway, but as they received these and did not receive them as entertainment, and in fact, in the movie, refer to them as our historical documents. And they say, well, when we started to receive your historical documents, we latched on to the one called Galaxy Quest, and they eventually modeled their whole civilization after it, modeled all of their technology after it. And there's this really great exchange when they're figuring this out, where one of the actors is like, wait a minute, what do you mean historical documents? And they explain it to him, and you're like, you don't think that Gilligan's Island was real? And the Thermians' reaction is like, oh, those poor people. Those poor people. It's pretty funny. I bring all this up because it's fun, and that's what we're doing this summer. But two, to just kind of, this is a pretty strong, analogy of what it is that we sometimes struggle with as people living now and in history now, and as people trying to be Christians now in the 21st century. You may have noticed that we read from the book of Revelations this morning, and some of you keen-eyed might have noticed that's not a book we read from a lot. And it's not one that I tend to use a lot. And the reason I tend to not use the book of Revelations a lot is we have the Thermian problem with it, right? The book of Revelations exists, I mean, obviously it's in our Bible, and it is a particular kind of work that we don't have and don't really use a lot anymore. There were so many different categories of writing 2,000 years ago that we don't tend to practice now. So we're not always immediately sure what to do in our brains when we encounter the book of Revelations and what it is that we are supposed to and intended to do with it. Two very popular categories of writing at the time of Jesus and in the first century. One were creation stories. A lot of people had very different creation stories. We preserve our understanding of creation and our creation story in the first 2 chapters of Genesis, right? Those are our creation stories. And we've talked about things like Genesis chapter 1. We've talked about that is written as a creation story, and it's also written in the form of a poem. So that's how we should understand it, and that's where we should go with it. And that's how our first engagement with Genesis chapter 1 should be to say, this is a poem. It's a creation poem. It's a certain kind of writing. Now, we don't write a lot of these anymore, but at the time, it happened a lot. The end of the book of Revelations, is known as what's known as apocalyptic literature, which we don't also really have a lot of today. We're just living the apocalypse. We don't need to write about it. No, I'm not usually this negative, and I'm not really. And the closest analogy I could come up with to how to understand this category was think about kind of almost like disaster movies, like the famous disaster movies like 2012, where I always think of the Towering Inferno. I grew up watching that on USA late at night, or the Poseidon Adventure, things like that, where everything goes wrong, but somehow the human beings overcome. So the book of Revelations, John Revelations, is really written in that same thing. And of course, what it is actually a written account of is a vision that John had. Now, God, throughout the Bible, we actually talked about this at our Tuesday night book club this last week. This idea that throughout the Bible, God uses things like visions to communicate things with people. What's written as the book of Revelation is John's vision. It's a I'm going to forget the word, an apocalyptic vision about what happens at the end of the world. And because it is a vision, and because that's what God uses, if we go throughout the Bible and we see the different vision that God gives people, God uses visions in a similar way that we may experience dreams. Visions are given to us, and they're given to us as a form of metaphor. So all of this is a build-up to say, when we approach the book of Revelations, we first must understand it as an apocalyptic vision within this certain genre of apocalyptic literature, and it's a vision that is given to John that is being understood as metaphor. So if we are trying to go to the book of Revelations and treat it like a decoder ring, right, where if we can just crack the code, we'll get the secret message to drink more Ovaltine. Yeah, some of you got that one. All right, it's all movies today, by the way. That somehow will unlock the secrets of the book, right? That somehow it's, that's the point of it. When the reality is, and how especially those in the 1st and 2nd century would understand it, was very differently. They would understand it as, this is a vision, this is a metaphorical understanding of the world and how it is and how it will be. Right? So we probably shouldn't be wasting our time waiting for 4 literal people riding horses to come over the or some of the other. Honestly, if you want just some fun times, just spend some time reading the book of Revelations and some of the interesting imagery that is present in it, and is actually very, very, both very colorful and can be very confusing unless we put it in the context it's meant to be put in, which is in this metaphorical vision. Okay. 10 minutes of preamble, I understand. This is why we don't use the book of Revelations, because, not that often. We should probably just do a series on it. Should we do a series on the Revelations? Yeah, you're excited about it. There's a lot of great hymns written out of the book of Revelations. There's so much great language in there. And if you actually do read it, you're going to recognize a lot of verses and a lot of things that are used in hymns and stuff, because it is just such amazing colorful and metaphorical language that just lends itself really well to hymns and things like that. So we actually do quote from a lot, even if we don't know that's what we're doing. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, if you go to the end of the book, if you go to where we read right now, and if you checked out where we are, we're actually in the last chapter of the last book. There isn't much after this, and it's this whole section about this idea of the New Jerusalem, and it's basically talking about when the time comes for everything we know to be done, what happens next. And the big thing, if we want to, we can get lost in the details about the streets of gold and all that kind of stuff and really kind of get into that. And the problem with doing that, and the problem with digging in that regard and making that the focus of our work, is we can forget to concentrate on the big thing that God is actually trying to communicate with the last two chapters of the book of Revelations. And the thing that I believe, anyway, that God is trying to communicate in the last two chapters of the book of Revelations is, at the end of the day, New Jerusalem, this idea of heaven, as Kimberly talked about in her children's message, all that stuff, that isn't some far off place. If you pay attention to what actually happens, that New Jerusalem, that heaven comes here. At the end of the day, it is about God coming here to be with us in a new way. Our future home with God will eventually be our current home. At the end of the day, it is not about actually being carried off to some far off place. At the end of the day, how the story ends is that the New Jerusalem, that heaven, that God comes here, and we get to be together, all of us together, in a new way, in a new place that is also the old place. The story of the Bible, and the story of the ending of the Bible, and the story of the ending of the world really isn't everything we think that it is, or we built it up to be. The story of the end is everybody coming home to be together. And if we miss that, and if we forget that, and if we don't recognize that as the most important element of the story, then my fear is we miss the point. That as good and as amazing as sometimes the journeys are, and the road trips we take are, and the stories we bring home, and the adventures we have are great and wonderful, there is something special, there is something important, there is something sacred about coming home. And at the end of the day, God's whole purpose and mission with us is to eventually get back to where we started. We started the story in the book of Genesis. If you go to there, you'll see the start of the story of God and God's people being together in a garden around a tree. It ends with God and God's people being together in a garden around a tree. That's what we are meant to be. That is where we're meant to go. We are meant to go home. Now, I got a chance to experience this week while my family and I took a little road trip for a couple of days to the great metropolis of Miles City, Montana. So this is Gavin getting some amazing driving hours in, and our new dog Paco navigating for him quite diligently. In fact, it was great. The dogs did good. They did okay. No. All right. So my mother-in-law still lives in Miles City, and my wife and I both graduated high school there. I went to middle school there. It is the place that I claim, even though I moved around a lot growing up until a certain point, the place I spent the most time growing up is in Miles City. And though Dane spent a lot of time going to all sorts of different places, 9 different schools or something like that in 5 years or something ridiculous, it's funny. Once her mom got to Miles City, her mom and dad got to Miles City, they stayed put, right? They stopped moving as soon as she graduated high school, which seemed really fair. And she's not bitter about it all. So for us, in a lot of ways, Miles City is home. And so we got to go home. We got to go home visit Dane's mom and her aunt and her uncle for a little while. And it's always a really interesting time to visit. It's always interesting to visit Miles City. It's always interesting to go home. And what's interesting, if you don't know, so if you have a Mac like I do, if you go to the Photos app, it'll actually show you where all your photos are taken. So I was looking for a particular picture and I pulled up, so this is the Miles City area. If you can't immediately recognize it along I-94, how would you not? And what I found interesting as I was looking at this, I realized of all the pictures I've taken in Miles City, almost all of them, 133 of them, are on that little dot, which is in fact Dane's mom's house. right? I mean, not only is this going home, this is literally going home, right? And that's oftentimes where we spend our time, and it's where we have our fun, and it's what our family does, as most of us do when we go home, because we want to go home and spend time with the people we love. And also, it's Miles City, and there isn't much to do. God love you. All right. But the one thing that is kind of fun, so there's a lot of things that's kind of fun about going home is you get to run into people. You get to run into people that maybe you haven't seen for a long time. And the beauty of being from a small town is if there's somebody to run into, you will probably run into them. It's a little bit like, it's almost worse than going to Hayes Market, as far as that's concerned, because you will run into people if you wander around long enough. We visited a couple of years ago, and we went to get some ice cream because my kids wanted ice cream. Who knew? And I ran across somebody that I had not seen in years. I think we have a picture. So this is my friend Shirley. Shirley was the secretary at the church that I grew up in. And just for whatever reason, I think maybe because we were, the kids of a single mom and all that kind of stuff, Shirley always took a special interest in me and my brother and my sister, and always loved on us any time that she could get. And even though I wasn't looking forward to it, I was so excited to see her. And we had so many memories to share together that it just became this special and sacred moment. That is the specialness and sacredness of sometimes going home. There are many stories that we now know and that we now like to remember when we go. Probably one of the most special ones that we shared with Dane's mom was about, it would have been about, let me do some math here, 17 years ago, for her mom's birthday. Her dad arranged for us to fly in. We were living in Albuquerque at the time. Fly in to surprise her for her birthday. In order to do that, we had to hide in the bathroom at this kind of old converted warehouse that he and his friends used to hang out in, and still I think some of them do, called Stinkies. What it's called. Apparently, back in the day, it's where they used to repair the garbage trucks. But now it's this place where a bunch of old guys hang out and cook food. Anyway, and apparently have parties for their wives. So we got to hang out in this bathroom and while we were waiting for Dane's mom to come. And of course, we got to come out as they were singing Happy Birthday, come out as a surprise and be like, we're here, yay. And it's one of those moments where it takes like a second for her to process, wait a minute, you're not supposed to be here. You're not from here. And it was a great moment. And what made that moment even greater is the next day around around their dinner table, we got to let them know that they were going to get to be grandparents for the first time. That was a sacred and special moment. One of the things that I've noticed about our trips recently to Miles City, when we would first go back, when you'd go back like in college or you went back for like our 10-year reunion, oftentimes we would go and do stuff. We would go and visit the people we knew. Right? We were still in the business of making new memories while we were there. Anymore, when we go, sure, we do nice fun stuff with the kids and maybe we get some ice cream and we do all that. But most of our time seems to be more about remembering the things that have already happened, recalling those memories, getting to talk about them, celebrate them again, get to be in a space where we can talk and celebrate the good things that have happened. We get to talk and celebrate and reminisce about some of the people that we've lost along the way, remind ourselves of who they were and the bit of them that continues to live in us. There is something sacred and special about going home that can only really be done at home. Now, the truth is, my home isn't our home anymore. My home from when we were there belongs to somebody else. My mom had moved away long ago, and she and a lot of my other family live now in Albuquerque. What's interesting is when I go down there, or if we go down there when we visit with them, we do the same thing. Even though she lives in a house I never lived in, it still has the stuff in it that I remember and the pictures of the wall of all the sacred things that we did together and special things that we did together. And she and my brother and I can still get together and talk about all those things. And there's still this sense of home, even though it's a place that I had never actually myself lived. Home is sometimes about place, but is more oftentimes about people. There are certain people, certain memories, certain things that help us feel at home no matter where we are. I think that sense of home is that sacred sense of home that God intends us to have. It is that sacred sense of home that God is talking about when he says, there is a new Jerusalem that is coming here. It's about not necessarily a new place, but it is a place where we all get to be at home together. And sure, it's wonderful that the streets are paved in gold, though that sounds really slippery. And I wouldn't want to ride my bike down it. And it's great that there are trees with fruit, and it's apparently great that the sun constantly shines and it's never dark, even though I like looking at stars. The New Jerusalem isn't really even about a place. It's about a way of being. It's about a way of feeling. It's about not a physical place, but a spiritual place. Not a physical home, but a spiritual home. That spiritual home where we all get those good feelings that we get when we're around those people who remind us the best of who we are and all of those good times we had. Now, I'm sensitive at this time to remember that not everybody has a fantastic sense of home. Not everybody got to grow up in an environment that was affirming and loving. Some of us, home was about escaping. Home was about leaving behind bad habits. Leaving home was about leaving behind abuse. Leaving home was about leaving behind all of that baggage. That work too is important and it is sacred. And I think God has a very special kind of love for people who've had that experience. I think the love that God has for each and every one of us is special and important. But I think God has a special place in his heart for those who never really actually got to know the kind of love at home that many of us cherish and have known. And I oftentimes wonder if the first ones who get to walk through the gates of that new Jerusalem to that new spiritual home will probably be them, because they are probably the ones most in need of it. We talk a lot about the church being kingdom builders, that is our job. Our job is to be a little outpost of God's kingdom here on earth. And that is true. We also have to remember that at the end of the day, God's kingdom comes here. The New Jerusalem comes here. The earth has been and always will be God's kingdom. And what does that kingdom look like? Does that mean we're supposed to be out there paving the streets with gold? I don't think so. That sounds really expensive. What that looks like is that our job is to build a home. The other thing we like to talk about here in this place is our call to love God, love neighbor, and love ourselves. To me, that is how you build the home that God intended. To build a place, to provide a space where everyone feels welcome, where everyone is loved as they are. We talk about that as the same. Everybody is loved as they are, welcomed as they are, given a space as the table that they are, given access to the refrigerator like they live there, able to change the TV on the channel on the remote if they want to. Though that makes less and less sense anymore, especially the young people who don't have those things. That's what we are about. So long as we are creating space where God and neighbor and self are loved, and that people are taught that they are to love and that they are themselves lovable, then we are building the homes that God intended. We should be building those homes in our own homes, in our own families, for sure. But neighbor isn't constrained to those who are related to us. As a church, we build those spaces. We build those spaces here physically in person, and I know many of you were so excited when we could come back because this is a place of home and peace for you, and that is amazing. We also have those who gather with us at their own homes, and they talk about how sacred and amazing it is to sit around the couch together with those that they love and care about and worship God together, and that is sacred and special too. Anytime we are about the place and job, anytime we are about the task of creating home in the way that God intended, then we are doing God's work. So yes, the road trips are great and the adventures are great and going out into the world is great. and getting to see all the things that we've seen and talk about all the things we've talked about and have those experiences and get to have really amazing times and conversations. And we ourselves, my family now, have experiences. We're going to have so many stories about, hey, remember that time in the car with the dog? There's like 4 of those just from this one road trip. And we will remember those times. And we will laugh about those times, and we will smile about those times. And you know where we will do that? Around our dinner table at the house, when we are feeling at home. So let us be that. Let us remember that at the end of the day, all of the roads eventually end up at the New Jerusalem. All of the roads eventually lead you home, to that place that God has given us and asked us to be part of and caretakers of. That place and space where we are all welcomed, that there's a chair at the table with our name on it, where our names are remembered and our lives are celebrated and the memories are shared with joy. And let us remember, when we are at that work, we are the kingdom builders that God calls us to be. Amen.